Good afternoon. My name is Sam Gralty. I'm the events manager with Vermont Land Trust, and welcome to Preserving Ash for the Future. Thanks so much for joining us. If you're not familiar with Vermont Land Trust, we're a membership organization dedicated to protecting farmland, forest land, and community lands across the state. Since 1977, we've permanently protected over 640,000 acres, which equates to roughly 11% of the state. As I said, a few Zoom reminders before we get started. We are recording this, but because it's a webinar, you're not going to appear in the recording. If you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom. That also allows you to enter your questions there. And we also have the feature enabled where if you see somebody else's question that you're interested in, you can give that a thumbs up. And we'll tend to do questions that maybe have more interest from other folks as well. So if you are especially interested in another person's question, feel free to give that an upvote as well. If you do have any technical issues, feel free to chat directly with me, but please try to keep questions to the Q&A so we can keep them all straight. We also will have a VLT forester, Caitlin Cusack, who, if she can answer some smaller questions in the Q&A directly, she's going to do that as well. And lastly, if you would like to have closed captions enabled, you can definitely enable those at the bottom of your screen as well. And one other reminder, as part of registration, we asked folks if folks were interested in receiving continuing education credits for this. If you did indicate that you wanted those, what we're going to do is compare that list to the attendee list, and we will send out an email with a certificate afterwards, probably early next week. So be on the lookout for that. And I'd also ask that if you are interested in getting those credits, make sure that your name in Zoom appears as your full name. So we can make sure that we can do a good cross-reference of those two lists. But yeah, now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. First off is Dr. Tony D'Amato, who's a professor of silviculture and forest ecology at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. And secondly, Paul Catanzaro is a professor and state extension forester at the University of Massachusetts. And I will hand it over to Tony, and I'm going to end this poll so we can all give our attention to Tony.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks, folks, for logging in today. It is a beautiful day, certainly in Vermont, so all of us shouldn't be looking at a computer, but appreciate those that are, and do want to acknowledge, really appreciate Vermont Land Trust organizing this event. As you'll see as we go throughout this presentation, we are not experts or coming up with a single solution for dealing with the challenges that emerald ash borer pose to our forests. Really, this is a community that's formed via many partnerships, many perspectives, many worldviews across the Northeast, across the Lake States. And so we really feel fortunate to be part of this community and learning from others, including many of you that are logging in today. And so thanks everyone for the interest in the topic, and then importantly for Vermont Land Trust for continuing to champion, I think, some innovative and thoughtful ways for preserving ash for the future. So, as we all appreciate, those of you that are logging in from the Northeast, we are really lucky to have forests that are quite mixed, whether we are reminded of that during the fall or when we're just walking around looking at bark textures. And that mixture really provides a lot of different benefits. But if we break it down into individual species, all the species that constitute our forest have unique roles to play, whether it's from an economic standpoint, an ecological standpoint, a cultural standpoint. And as we gain more and more non-native insects and pathogens, there's the potential for any of those individual species to be threatened. And that moment really changes how we feel about the forest and feel about that species. All of a sudden it's threatened. All of a sudden we're worried about losing it. And that can really influence, how we proceed with our perspectives on the long-term stewardship of that area, as well as the long-term stewardship of that tree into the future. And so what we're hoping to do today is provide some perspective on just the collective community of knowledge and ideas that have been developing around how do we actually think about keeping ash as part of our landscape, as part of our traditions, as part of the fabric of what we do in the forest, and kind of pull together both some thoughts around just the context for ash today, as well as just some general framing for how we might think about preserving ash, and then get into some specific strategies people are trying to do, whether it be family forest owners, national forests, or tribal partners across the region. So hopefully today, for many of you is another way to think about, can we, put the species first and really think about ways in which we sustain ash into the future. But just to acknowledge reality, when we interact with the forest or anything in our lives, things that can really influence our behavior often aren't ecology or what some silviculture professor might say is the way to manage the forest. It's often driven by things like our emotions, our fear, our anxiety, our reaction to the potential risk of losing something. And so within the context of emerald ash borer, particularly for those of you that are logging in regions where we still have a lot of mature ash on the landscape, those that pay attention to the value of white ash, it's held pretty strong in many of those areas. And actually the most recent stumpage price reports for New York have ash going for over $1,000 per thousand. And so there's certainly this economic motivation, which is important. We want to make sure that we're still, sustaining wood products from our forests, but it sometimes can override, what might make most sense ecologically in long term for that site. Likewise, a lot of work that's surveyed landowners and trying to understand how they feel about invasive insects and how that might influence their behavior have found that, if threatened by an insect, in their forest land, landowners are actually motivated, by a majority to actually possibly do management to address that. And so we want to make sure that, with this backdrop of there's could be economic incentive, there's certainly this broader concern that we have about emerald ash borer and its effect on ash, that we're still, as the Guild would say, putting the forest first, and as I like to say, managing the forest, not the insect, really thinking through, how do we still sustain those values from our ecosystems while also acknowledging that we don't want to lose trees, we don't want to lose money, but can we balance that with broader goals that are guiding stewardship. So just to put this in kind of perspective as to what's out across our region, and I recognize some folks are coming from outside New England. These maps at least include all the way down the mid-Atlantic. When we look at statistics of how much of our forest is ash, about 4 to 5% of all of New England's trees are ash. And again, most of us recognize that's divided across 3 species: black ash, green ash, and white ash. But that small percentage really is misleading in that those of you that do spend time, looking at ash in the forest, oftentimes you stumble into large areas of ash, whether it's in a northern hardwood forest, in a pocket of enrichment, or you enter into a riparian zone where you all of a sudden are seeing a lot of green ash or black ash. And so when we're thinking about the threat of emerald ash borer and more importantly, our management response to it, sometimes the potential loss could be quite great given there's just a lot of those trees in any given unit of ground. And so this map here, the hotter the color is just showing kind of the areas that have high levels of ash abundance. And so those that know your bedrock geology can see some of that's tracking where we have good calcium-rich soils or former agricultural areas. And likewise with black ash, there's lots of high concentrations of that, certainly in northern New York, as well as large portions of Maine. So these species, even though they might not be regionally abundant per se, when we compare them to sugar maple, can be very important locally. So when we get into making management decisions about ash, and are we going to be, cutting ash in response to, economic drivers or fear of losing potential future opportunities for saw logs on the site, oftentimes those decisions are being made in upland forests, and in particular around white ash. And again, many of you are already familiar with this, but white ash really is a species that is a common feature, particularly of our rich northern hardwood communities across the East Coast. And so this graph on the left, again, is just looking at the proportion of total volume that white ash makes in less enriched, so kind of average soil northern hardwood forests, and then in enriched soils, so soils that have calcium bedrock, derived bedrock. And so those sites where we have either good bedrock or localized enrichment, white ash can be a very large chunk of that forest. And so again, these are the areas where we're making a lot of management decisions anyway. And so oftentimes we're faced with this situation where we have a threatened tree species in a forest that we're doing forest management. How can we do that in a way that's also thinking about long-term options from the forest? But even though white ash is a species that we often talk about in terms of stumpage prices and talk about in terms of management, when we reflect on the true deepest impact of emerald ash borer on our region, it's not on white ash. It's truly on black ash or brown ash for those of you that are logging in from Maine. And many, again, hopefully are very familiar with this potential impact. But if you're not, what I've done here is outline the range of black ash. and just overlay that on top of the traditional territories of tribal nations across northeastern North America. And whether it be the snowshoe tree to the Anishinaabe people in the western part of its range, or the center of creation for the Wabanaki people, black ash is central to cultures, central to cultural lifeways like baskets, snowshoes. It's certainly been used for lacrosse sticks for generations. And so when we think of the loss of the species, it's not just about losing stumpage, it's not just about losing ecological value. There's a deep cultural value we're trying to sustain as well with partnership with tribal nations. And so when we look at our landscapes and walk across any portion of it, depending on where you are, you may be intersecting with one and sometimes even two ash species. And much of this really has to do with, I often say, how wet are your boots? People that have trouble differentiating green ash from white ash, if it's August and your boots are wet, you're probably looking at a green ash. But in general, we think of white ash, as I mentioned, very characteristic of our rich sites, or benches, coves, toe slopes where we have localized enrichment. Green ash, besides being widely planted in our urban and ex-urban environments, is also naturally quite common in riparian zones, and actually of the three species can tolerate the highest amount of flooding. And then black brown ash is a species that also can be in riparian zones and grows quite well in those zones, but it does really well with kind of saturated soils, needs some soil aeration, but actually can be in more bottomlands and we can kind of think of mucky, boggy sites. And what's important is that those of you that are logging in from the Northeast, across this entire gradient, there are still many mature, healthy ash that are out there across the landscape. And we're thinking about in terms of how do we preserve that across the region. And Paul's going to take that a bit further with the next part.
Hey, everybody. Welcome and thanks for coming. EAB, of course, spread from the Midwest over the last 20 or so years, and we're seeing, as the map shows, that the detections of EAB are sort of scattered around various counties across the Northeast. And what that does is that in many ways puts us in different people in different stages of the infestation. Some people may not have had it come yet. Others may have had it a while and have lost most of their ash trees and many places in between. But what we're seeing is that and this will relate to the strategies that Tony talks about. We need to have strategies across multiple scales. People are going to be in different places. Everybody is going to play a different role, hopefully, in the preservation of ash and the management of our forests. But we can see that people are in different stages. Tony, next slide. This is a diagram from an effort that Tony led with a group of people that we'll show at the end of the presentation. And this led to the publishing of two specific Journal of Forestry articles. The first one included this diagram, which I just want to talk about. In the first journal article, even though we're here under the context of emerald ash borer and sustaining and preserving ash, the original publication is really focused on species preservation. And so these are, I guess you'd say, broad goals as to why it's important to preserve all species, even though we're here specifically to talk about ash in particular. But coming down the pipeline, we don't know what new invasive insect may be coming, and setting up a framework and setting up a sort of a conceptual model of what these goals might be that we're trying to obtain, we thought was very important. Many of us, of course, may have come into this webinar under the ecological function. Many of us professionally and as landowners or land trust members may really be focusing on that one, but recognize there are multiple goals that we're trying to achieve through species preservation. The goals, of course, overlap. Ecological, those activities that might be specific to ecological function may also help with cultural integrity or ethical responsibility, for example. And defining your goals can also help define what specific approaches that you undertake in order to achieve those goals. Next slide. So I just want to walk through those. The first goal is just our ethical responsibility. We believe that all things have a place in the forest and in the world, and that it is an ethical responsibility for us to treat all of those and to sustain all of those species. And we see this, at least I'm most familiar with conversations about this around biodiversity, right? That organizations, landowners want to sustain an entire range of native biodiversity, that we have an obligation to sustain those species across the landscape. So one of those goals for species preservation is just our ethical obligation, our responsibility to other living things in order to sustain those. I would also mention that we introduced emerald ash borer to our landscapes, to our region, and therefore I would suggest we have a responsibility for helping to minimize the impacts, help move this species through this challenge. And then I guess the last thing I would just say in terms of this ethical responsibility is many of you, or at least some of you on the webinar today, are foresters, and many of us are involved in professional societies, whether it be the Guild or SAF or ACF, but we also have ethical responsibilities as professionals to sustain the species and all species. Next slide. Tony hit on this a few slides ago, so I'll just touch on it briefly, but there are cultural, important, critical, essential cultural values associated with all species, ash in particular, whether it be the origin story, creation story that Tony mentioned, or baskets, or the use of bark by the Nipmuc on traditional homes. Ash is inextricably intertwined with cultural practices and cultural lifeways. And as we preserve a species, we are actually helping to preserve those cultural lifeways and those people. Next slide. Genetic preservation. We're fortunate that trees are a very rich source of genetic material as an organism. They have a lot of genetic, each individual has a lot of genetic diversity. They're long-lived. And it is critical as one of our goals to preserve that genetic diversity, even though we are seeing obviously tremendous amounts of mortality. There are still some species, individuals out in the Midwest that have survived the first wave. You know, is there a genetic individuals out there with genetic material that can help sustain, provide resistance, and provide the foundation potentially for us moving forward in terms of spreading that genetic resistance. So one of the goals is to maintain that genetic diversity at both at the property, at the landscape, and the region scale. And we'll talk about some of those opportunities later in the presentation. Next slide. And then, of course, many of us, as I mentioned, probably walked through the door because of this goal, which is ecological functionality, that each species, as Tony said, within our wonderfully diverse forests, plays a unique role, has unique characteristics that it has developed and evolved to over time that other species have evolved with. One lit review suggests that there are almost 100 invertebrate species that primarily feed on the leaves of ash. And to give you a sense of scale, they further estimate, another paper estimates that there are about 5 that depend on chestnut. So, you know, unfortunately, we've somewhat lost chestnut from our forest, certainly in the historic context we have. But, you know, here, 98 individual species that depend on this one tree. So I know sometimes we think of our forests as these monolithic things, but each species matters. If we were to take that away, it sort of starts fraying that connection. It reduces the resilience of each of these individual species. So one of our goals, of course, as many of you are tuned into, is the ecological functionality of each of these. Next slide. Just want to give a couple broad findings from some research that we did. I did with the Family Forest Research Center and with Tony and others in this group that he pulled together and led, trying to get a sense of people's reactions to EAB, that we know EAB is out there on the landscape having an impact on our forests, of course, but of course we are also out on the landscape and we are sometimes reacting to it and sometimes not reacting to it. And in both ways has, an influence on what's happening in our landscape. And then if we are reacting to it, how are we reacting to it? And so we wanted to get a sense from a survey of foresters and loggers to get a sense of how all of them, or you, depending on your role, are reacting to EAB. And one of the couple things, these are just some sort of highlights I pulled out that I thought might be pertinent, but I thought it was pertinent. There were a lot of conversations about our people going out and searching out ash lots and specifically targeting those. And although we did find about a third are, about a 2/3 of people say that they're not out targeting ash, and they haven't increased the amount of ash that they're focusing in on for timber harvesting. About 57% of the respondents told us that it was the ecological impact, harkening back to the last slide, that ecological integrity, there was about 57% of people said that it's the ecological integrity that really was motivating them to implement strategies in forests that include ash, including 85% said that they're taking more of the larger ash, and about 50% said that they are increasing their harvest intensity. And the loggers in particular talked about increasing intensity with cordwood in efforts to open up bigger gaps and establish some regeneration in the wake of the impacts of EAB. Some of those goals, people told us that the economic value was the most significant regeneration goal that they had, followed by ensuring species diversity, and then making sure that there are species that are regenerating in that forest that are going to be well adapted to future conditions. Only about 27% of respondents said that they were putting intentional effort towards regenerating ash. Most of those, about 24% of the folks, said that it was a high priority. Only 3% of people said that regenerating ash was an essential priority. And then this last bullet, I hope, helps us jump off into the strategies that Tony will talk about. But when we asked folks what their challenges were and what their needs were, we heard a very strong signal. The top need that people reported was that 70% said that they are looking for more silvicultural guidelines or silvicultural strategies to help forests move through this challenge. And I think one of the big stories is that we have an impact. The story is still evolving, and you have an important role to play with that. And Tony's going to talk about some specific preservation and silvicultural strategies.
Yeah, so I think, with many forest pests, we often first try to evaluate, can we thin the forest? Can we do something, with our traditional management toolbox that minimizes the impact of that pest and keeps those trees healthy and happy? And unfortunately, with emerald ash borer, there's always been kind of the general conclusion there is no kind of purely silvicultural solution. But there are a lot of ways that we can pull together just a collective understanding of how integrated pest management and other creative ways to do preservation work and can be brought to bear onto a given landscape to keep ash out there. And that includes silviculture, but really includes many other strategies that we're going to work through for the rest of the presentation. And so if we were to broadly categorize the different ways we can preserve species, when we're talking about preserving ash with silvicultural methods, it's both what we're deciding not to cut. So we want to be leaving some ash behind, but also, as Paul was mentioning, doing, management activities that actually are recruiting new ash on that site. So if we're removing ash, if we're doing harvesting, are we actually doing the appropriate regeneration methods to get that species back? Again, Paul will talk about this a bit more, but we know there are some very effective insecticides that can limit the impact of EAB and keep trees healthy. And so how do we actually use those across our forested landscapes? Likewise, a lot of advances in biocontrols that limit populations of EAB. And so how do we use those either on their own or more often in conjunction with other strategies to sustain that species? And then something I'm going to elaborate on in a second is, what do we actually do to protect the cultural values of ash? What do those strategies look like, and how might that be a little bit different than some of the traditional integrated pest management approaches we might talk about? And then, of course, with any challenge where there's really no clear solution, but it's a grand challenge to deal with, we want to be bringing together many combinations to try to be successful and at different scales and at different combinations. So returning back to the cultural piece, I recognize again that many on this webinar are hopefully deeply aware of efforts and hopefully have even contributed to efforts to try to preserve black ash or brown ash for future generations as part of the landscape and as part of kind of traditional lifeways. But when we're talking about cultural adaptation, really, it's not just about keeping trees alive on the landscape, but also making sure that those key materials that come from those trees, as well as those customs and traditions tied to those trees, are sustained. And so one piece that's often really critical, and again, many of you are well aware of this, are what's pictured here on the left. These are splints that have been pounded from black ash, and these are used for making baskets and other artisanal crafts, and as well as goods that are used for day-to-day activities like carrying potatoes, strawberries, etc. And so if we lose black ash from the landscape, can we still make sure we have a lot of splints that can be used by future generations? Likewise, collecting seeds, and particularly seeds of black ash to sustain that species for future options for planting on the landscape. And so whenever we mention any approach to adapting to the impacts of emerald ash borer, we have to acknowledge the amazing body of work and knowledge that we all benefit from, particularly from the Akwesasne Mohawk and Les Benedict and Richard David, who prior to emerald ash borer were already trying to find ways to increase and sustain black ash on their lands for future generations. And so there's some tremendous knowledge that we certainly benefit from that really helps us think through how do we thoughtfully collect seed, pound splints, and do it in a way that both honors ash and also is using incredible indigenous knowledge around how to do this well and how to do this in ways that are successful in the landscape. And so this guide you're seeing on the left, dated to the year 2000, long before we were talking about collecting ash seed for emerald ash borer, is kind of remains the authority on how do we actually collect ash seed and preserve it. And then there's a recent update that's been done through efforts at the University of Maine and the ash protection collaboration across Wabanakik that folks can go online and find. Emily Francis led this work. It's just a great resource for like how do we get out there and make sure we're collecting ash and also thinking about sustaining those values into the future. But I'm going to shift into silvicultural approaches. Won't go too in depth on this, just so we can cover some other approaches. But we're really talking a little bit about just how do we think about the basics of silviculture and how that intersects with the goal to keep a threatened species on the landscape. And I'm going to specifically be talking about this in the context of white ash, just given that's where a lot of our management decisions are occurring, where we're actually cutting trees and manipulating stands. And so I think, one thing that's quite interesting, and I certainly fall into this, is that, when we're walking through the woods and every tree in that forest might not have a known threat, we just look at that tree as we've always looked at it. It's going to behave the same way. It's going to be a part of that forest into the future. And we might not, really act much differently about it when we're talking about, maybe managing for biodiversity or managing for other goals we might have for that landscape. But unfortunately, the second that emerald ash borer shows up in an area, or even the threat of emerald ash borers on the horizon, there are some that might all of a sudden just see that ash in that stand and view it as something that needs to go, that needs to be removed, is higher risk. And what that totally does is ignore the fact that it's still part of an ecological system that we want to be sustaining into the future and honoring and supporting. And so what it does is often limit and sometimes actually impact potential future options on that site, both silviculturally, but importantly, economically and ecologically. And so when we're thinking about emerald ash borer and doing silviculture in the context of emerald ash borer, the first step is it still should be good, sound, ethical silviculture. And then we kind of think about how does that fit into both landowner goals, but also goals for keeping ash in the landscape. And so the key element of all of this really boils down to the silvics, or the ecological characteristics of white ash. And many of you are well aware of this, but white ash is what we consider kind of a large gap obligate species. It needs large openings to regenerate. And so one of the concerns and what's been observed in other parts of its range where white ash has been removed by emerald ash borer is that it exists in these mixed forests. And so even though it might be 20, 30% of the canopy, underneath that white ash might be sugar maple, beech, in some cases buckthorn, honeysuckle. And so when we have these gaps forming like this picture here from emerald ash borer, it's not large enough for new white ash to establish. And so other species take over the site. At the same time, if I just go through a site with a paint gun and just paint all the white ash, there might be some pockets where there's a few ash together, but other areas where ash is scattered. And that similar approach where we're just removing kind of individual trees here and there isn't going to open that stand up enough in places to actually recruit that species. And so if we want ash in the future on a site, all silviculture should be thinking about how do I keep some mature ash if I have them out there? And importantly, when I'm cutting other ash or cutting other species, am I doing it in a way that's giving me the gap sizes I need to actually recruit that tree across the landscape? And so what we're trying to avoid is a situation on the left, and this is from South Central Vermont, where this harvest basically went through this stand and just took out all the ash. And you can see those that know their tree forms. These are all basically were intermediate and kind of lower canopy codominants that were left behind after they removed all the ash above them. But collectively, there's far too much shade for white ash to regenerate. And more importantly, if you look at the form of those trees, they haven't left the greatest selection of economic options on that site. Right adjacent to that parcel on the right, on some state managed land, we're looking at here, anything with blue, these are going to be cut. These are white ash. But this L here is a legacy, and essentially 10% of all the ash in the site were being left behind as permanent legacy trees. And so they're opening the stand up enough to get the recruitment that white ash needs, but they're also leaving trees behind to serve as seed sources, to serve as future genetic repositories. And importantly, it's still removing a lot of ash volume, but it's doing it in a way that's thinking about like, how does this sustain ash in the site? And how is it doing it in a way that really is respecting future options economically and ecologically? So as Paul mentioned, there's been a lot of interest around the region and harvesting in response to emerald ash borer, and certainly people are motivated primarily thinking about ecological outcomes. And we surveyed over 40 sites where they've been doing management in response to emerald ash borer over the last 7 or 8 years. One of those sites was the VLT mud pond demonstration forest, where really the focus is what we would call ash regeneration. So they're actually harvesting that forest in ways that thoughtfully are considering how to get ash regeneration back, how to retain mature ash on the landscape. And we had other sites where they really were just focused on like removing ash. They might still factor in regen, but really it was trying to remove that ash component. What we've largely found is that just writ large, when we're focusing on ash regen, we're also recruiting many other species that we would view as, I think, desirable, like yellow birch, sugar maple, and we're doing it in ways that really are allowing that site to recover quickly with that diversity of ecological options that Paul was mentioning. And so focusing in on ash regen in our management is just kind of basic principles. We're thinking this through. At the same token, not every tree is going to die unless we cut it, right? And I always like to say, there's no tree immune to a chainsaw. So if something's resistant to emerald ash borer, and then we decide to cut it, we've kind of lost that opportunity to even evaluate that dynamic. And as Paul mentioned earlier on, there's some work that came out where they went back and surveyed areas where emerald ash borer had been for almost 2 decades. And what we're looking at here is basically the number of trees surviving after a couple decades of emerald ash borer across different sites. And so some sites, almost 100% of the white ash were still alive, but other sites, 0%. So just pointing out that some do totally get wiped out. But the key point is there is resistance, particularly in white ash, that can't be overlooked. And so unless we leave trees behind, we won't know we have it out there. And so both for ecological, but also for preservation purposes, don't cut all the ash. We want that out there for many reasons. So a final point, and this is going to be actually in black ash forests, and this comes from work that the Akwesasne Task Force and the Environment's been doing in Brazier State Forest in New York in partnership with DEC, Fish and Wildlife, the Forest Service, and many university partners, where instead of just doing silviculture, instead of just doing insecticides, instead of just doing biocontrols, they're really trying to combine a lot of strategies all in one place, where they're both thinning to try to encourage the growth and vigor of ash on the site. They're also creating openings to recruit new black ash. And then any of the trees they're harvesting, those that are suitable for basket making, they're either preserving the splints or using those. And then also bringing to bear things like stem injection. You can see this black ash here has ports for stem injection of insecticides. This is Angela Johnson, and they're foresters with the tribe releasing biocontrols on the site. And so, as I mentioned, silviculture is certainly where we think about while we're cutting, while we're managing, but really we need to bring all these things together to preserve species on the site. And Paul's going to get into that a bit more as we think about preservation on different scales.
Thanks, Tony. So there are, different settings within the forest, whether they be uplands, riparians, or wetlands with different species. We've got different opportunities to sustain ash and to manage our forests. And I think if you walk away with nothing else today, please walk away realizing that the story of ash is not over. I too often feel like I run into people that feel like ash is done, and that there's a narrative out there that we might as well just harvest it and chalk it up and we've got lots of other species. Please don't let that be the narrative. This is a story in progress. We're trying to keep the plate spinning, right? Whether we're keeping different size ash, different age ash, collecting seed, creating openings, regenerating new ash, helping forests regenerate other species. This is in our actions have an impact, and so what we're trying to do is find combinations of things that will work, that will help sustain ash out on this landscape, so that we can maintain the wonderful benefits that it produces. And I don't want you to walk away thinking there's nothing to do and that it's all for nothing and people aren't out there doing that, because there's some wonderful things you can do, important things you can do, and people are out there trying it, and we need more people to be out there trying to find that combination and collaborating. Next slide. So one of the first things you could do is to help identify lingering ash. As we've both mentioned, ash are very genetically rich. There are wonderful repositories out there, and we want to identify not just where ash is and how it's spreading, but sort of the opposite of that. What survived? What are those? Who are those individuals out there that have survived? And so there is an effort afoot to try to identify where these lingering ash are, how many individuals are there, opportunities for collecting seed, opportunities for encouraging them to seed in and start new cohorts. So, this is a wonderful role that you can play, whether you're a forester out cruising, or you're a landowner out in your own woods, or a conservation organization. There is a group called Monitoring and Managing Ash that has a website that Tony has there on the slide that you can log into and help report that, flagging it, painting it, taking a waypoint with your phone or a GPS unit, and encouraging seed collection from that. But this is a really important point and opportunity to help us sustain ash. Next slide. Chemical injections are another way. Again, we're just trying to keep ash and genes out on the landscape. And there's no question about it. We have an opportunity to do that through the use of chemicals. And I recognize that brings up, a whole other conversation about the use of chemicals. But the reality is, without chemicals, we're going to lose, I think it's safe to say, most of our ash. And again, we're trying to keep the plate spinning. How do we keep more individuals out there that are helping to regenerate new cohorts, so that new trees can grow and buy us more time for us to find that right combination that can really impact this in the long run? And chemical injection is one of those. So imamectin benzoate is a chemical that can be used when before a tree has completely succumbed to EAB. So when it has maybe more than 50% of its crown still, those can be treated. This is a picture of Frank Caitlin Cusack here from Vermont Land Trust out there. She's now working with a backpack system that allows her to move around the woods. And I'll show a map of some of the locations the VLT and others are using. But this is an important way for us to maintain some of the genetic material, some individuals out on the landscape, and keep the plate spinning. It is costly, and so treatments are recommended every about 4 years. You can't do all of the trees, or maybe you can, but it's pretty cost prohibitive to do all of the trees in your forest. And so that gets us to this idea of trying to identify what we call these preservation patches. Next slide. So how can where on your property or those properties that you steward, can you find some groups of trees, some patches of ash trees that you can identify and help keep out on that landscape. Groups of, say, 12 to 15 trees, saw timber size or greater than 12 inches, right? We want them to be mature enough to be able to produce seed and regenerate and so forth. We want those close enough that they can fertilize one another and help create more ash out on the landscape. So keeping them within about 1 to 3 acres. Ash can seed maybe something like 4 to 450 feet. So we want to keep them close enough that they can fertilize one another. Selecting patches on sites that ash is well suited for. So as Tony said, those enhanced sites, those rich sites, choosing individuals that are high vigor, so those that are occupying at least a codominant, if not a dominant crown class. We ideally would want those to be high to female, so the ratio of male to female out there. So ash is what's known as dioecious. So there are individuals that are male and individuals that are female, and we would recommend that the large proportion of those 12 to 15 trees, say 60 to 75% of those, are females. Females, actually, we're coming up on the time that it would be great to get out in the woods and check for females, looking for flowers out in those ash trees, or in the early fall, looking for seeds. But identifying, and you've seen some of the photos that Tony's put up, where they've got an F on there for female, identifying those is an excellent opportunity to help us preserve. I like this graphic on the right, this picture, because this is what we're trying to get to, right? We want patches of ash across the landscape. It would be wonderful to have this network, these stepping stones that can be the sources of regeneration and sort of moving out across the landscape as we work out that combination of practices that can sustain ash. Next slide. So that was sort of a diagram of what we hope for, but here's some reality. These are people out there actually doing organizations. So sort of in time order sequence here, on the bottom left, you see some sites that the state of New Hampshire initiated, refusing that narrative that it was done and there was nothing to do. They went out and released some biocontrol, started seed collection, created preservation patches through the use of insecticide, and that really helped. I think it really helped people look around and say, you know, we can do this, or we don't have to sit still. Vermont Land Trust is another excellent example. 43 sites with preservation patches ranging from a dozen trees to a few dozen trees across the state. White Mountain National Forest, again, doing preservation patches across their landscape, as well as the Green Mountain National Forest. So people are out there trying to keep ash on the landscape, trying everything, of course, and in our indigenous partners, everything from collecting seeds to preservation patches to identifying lingering ash. So things are happening out on the landscape. Next slide. I like this slide because I think it helps demonstrate the important role each organization has. Here's just work at cross scales across Vermont. It's wonderful that it extends all the way north, all the way south. I love that there's Vermont Land Trust out there leading the way, statewide organization, TNC International Land Trust, the Equinox Preservation Trust, down at the local level, even helping to sustain one patch out there. The same with the public organizations. So we had a scale of private organizations, and then we obviously have organizations as big as the federal government, Green Mountain National Forest, as well as the town of Williston putting in a preservation patch. All of that adds up across a landscape. Every little part that every little owner does, or every forester helps facilitate, adds critical mass across the landscape to sustain the species. Next slide. So importantly, whether you're a landowner on the webinar today, you're a forester, you volunteer for your local land trust, or maybe you work for your municipality, we need people out there working together to sustain ash across the landscape by implementing, hopefully, a combination of these strategies, but implementing even one of those strategies, as we've seen from those maps, will matter, because the more people that are doing it, the more we will reach that critical mass to help sustain this and the longer we'll be able to sustain those plate spinning to give us time for this to settle out and for us to get a sense of how we can really move ash into the future, a more solid footing. Next slide. Of course, Indigenous partnerships are critical to this, as we've hit a number of times during this webinar. It is an incredibly important goal to sustain the cultural values that ash imparts, as well as other species. So no matter what geography you are in, connecting with Indigenous partners, starting a relationship, learning from what they're doing and helping to contribute to that, whether it be with inventories, whether it be seed saving. The other thing we didn't mention is cultural respect agreements. So helping provide access to Indigenous partners to get to areas that might have black or brown ash to help them, facilitate their efforts as well. Next slide. Conservation easements, for those of you involved in land protection or working at a land trust or a state agent or federal agency doing it, just thinking through, I think we're going to need to think through more and more what some of these strategies might be. We're talking specifically about ash today, but I would think it's probably safe to say that there are going to be other invasive insects that we're going to have to deal with in the future. And so how do our conservation easements, how can those be written in a way that allows us to react to and allow species preservation in the future? Things like chemicals or pests, insects, non-natives that we don't see coming. For those that might be interested in passive forest management, sort of what the definition of that is and what's allowed and when it's allowed, I think are all things we have to have hard conversations about, not just for ash, but for species preservations in general. Next slide. So a couple of resources we just wanted to share with you. If you're not familiar with Silvicast, it's a wonderful podcast to silviculturists from the state of Wisconsin. Very fun. Said the silviculture geeks, right? It's very fun. But this one in particular, season 5, episode 3, has an interview with researchers out in the Midwest, out in Ohio, doing work on ash, and it seems, I think it's safe to say they're on the front lines of that first wave and are now seeing, what the result has been, how much has survived, the forest response, ash's response, genetic implications, and so forth. So Silvicast is a wonderful resource in general, but this one in particular, if you're interested in ash, is a wonderful one to check out. Next slide. We've mentioned a couple times this partnership that Tony pulled together and led and resulted in a couple of journal articles. These are the journal articles. Again, the first one being broader, just talking about species preservation, particularly as we move into the future with, unfortunately, more threats. And then that second paper really diving down deeper into taking those goals, taking that species preservation framework and applying it specifically to ash. That effort, of course, if you can advance that, Tony, led to the development of a grant proposal to help sustain ash and create this network of ash partners across the Northeast that our friends at the Forest Stewards Guild have been leading. And so if you're interested in maybe some local contacts or what's happening locally, or sharing information or sharing a question, we were just on had an email flurry yesterday. Someone had a quick question about a video of how to inject a tree, and it was great. We're able to throw it out to partners across the region and get a lot of great information. So this is a great resource as well. Next slide. I'll let you bring us home, Tony.
Yeah, so thanks, Paul. And again, thanks everybody for logging in today. And hopefully it's apparent that this is a classic example of it really takes a village to deal with a novel and deeply impactful insect. And so much of what we shared today really is because we've been privileged to have relationships with a whole range of incredible creative thinkers that just bring different expertise and different worldviews to this issue, and really have served as a source of inspiration, whether it's the scale of preservation that the state of New Hampshire is doing, or learning from Les Benedict and John Daigle and others on thinking through how do we kind of center this knowledge and how we're addressing the threat of emerald ash borer to tribal nations across the region. And so I really want to acknowledge all those that have been on their own land, as well as through their own thinking and teaching. And I know Tyler Everett's name's not on the slide, but Tyler Everett is also a very big part of this effort as well. And so I really appreciate all that's gone into this, and certainly folks logging on today to hopefully listen, but also share perspective. If not in the Q&A, certainly we always welcome hearing what people are doing, because there's not a single one size fits all for this by any means. Just a quick plug for those that are looking for kind of a all in one place summary of some of the things we were talking about today. Paul led a great outreach pamphlet looking at various aspects, from how do you identify the different ash species to how do you think about preserving patches. And so if you go to masswoods.org, you can access that, or send Paul an email, and he's happy to send you a digital or physical copy of that pamphlet. Back to you, Sam.
All right, thank you so much. So we have a few minutes for some questions, and I will say right before we start those, we have some great questions, and obviously we won't have time for all of them. So I certainly will be following up with resources, and Paul and Tony can scan the questions that came in and try to edge some of those, or point some of those resources towards those. So, but I will say we got a few different questions about young trees, and James had a question that is sort of indicative of it. I'll just read it. So, in EAB infested stands, is regenerating ash via stump sprouting a good strategy? Thinking of projects where we can harvest mid-story ash that are 2 to 8 inches DBH and encouraging sprouting. This would be an attempt to avoid a second wave infestation. So, thoughts about that, or more generally, young saplings and things those lines.
Yeah, so I think even the example I gave from the mud pond demonstration forest that Vermont Land Trust is managing. One of the main points of emphasis with the regeneration was actually to get stump sprouts back, and so we're very fortunate that ash as a species really throughout all sizes sprouts. The bigger it gets, it might have one or two, but it really is a pretty consistent sprouter. So using that as a strategy to regenerate it, I guess in terms of if the idea is to try to cut it ahead of the wave of EAB coming through an area to minimize like the diameter of ash that it's going into. I mean, a lot of the work again that looks at like the minimum size that EAB will infest does suggest it will go down to like a 1-inch diameter tree. So they would still be vulnerable. One positive dimension of it is there are some parasitoids that are only effective on smaller sized trees, and so by having a mix of different sized trees, some larger, some smaller, it might actually increase the effectiveness of some of the parasitoids if somebody's releasing biocontrols in the site. But just fundamentally, yeah, I think stump sprouts we can't ignore. That's a great reliable source if they're put into a opening big enough to support them, and as we all appreciate, a curse that ash suffers from by being the first thing to spring up and being big, fat, and juicy tree as it gets hammered by deer. And so thinking about like how do you protect those sprouts, when they're coming off that stump.
Tony, it also occurs to me that it's just another way to keep the plate spinning, right? I mean, It's just, it may not last forever, but we're sustaining it. And if it were to get through into the overstory, become mature and throw seed, and then, it yet hopefully another iron in the fire to try to keep it moving forward.
Cool. We also had a couple questions about the sort of longer term. So one question was about how long does EAB stay in an area, especially around treatment? How long should you be planning to continue doing treatment? And then there's a separate question, but related, about after ash is, potentially fully removed from an area by predation, what can they move on to other trees? What happens basically after all the ash is gone to the actual insects?
Yeah, I mean, in those aftermath areas, I mean, you're still getting ash coming back. So obviously the EAB populations go down, a bit, but they're still kind of persisting at lower levels, I think, in trees that are resprouting and being infested. In terms of, you know, if you get rid of it, like say you're treating trees on your landscape, a good analogy would be like, it's just like if you're getting rid of buckthorn in your backyard, but like your neighbors are still keeping it in theirs, you still have like, there's still going to be emerald ash borer on the landscape. And so, you know, there is, once you start treating, you know, the goal, and the reason why we often say 4, and this is not my specific knowledge, is really Deb McCullough from Michigan State, who I view as the, you know, be all end all expert on how to kill emerald ash borer, and also, you know, how to think it through, is that, you know, after the 3rd year, if the tree gets infested by EAB again, it's still vigorous enough that when you add an application in the 4th year, it kills those trees, and the trees and it kills those larvae and EAB, and the tree's able to kind of bounce back and stay healthy. And so that 4-year cycle is assuming you still have emerald ash borer on the landscape, which I think we need to be assuming, and you know, it doesn't just like disappear completely. It's out there and shifting around.
There's a question about from Emily. I'm just going to read it though. There is a broad-based effort to the north, including many stakeholders, to preserve black and brown ash on the landscape. What have their outcomes been so far? Are there lessons we can learn from them?
Yeah, so I think just writ large, unfortunately, the challenge with black or brown ash, and again, those that are wondering why we're flipping it around, you know, primarily in Maine with the Wabanaki, the common name is brown ash, but, you know, Fraxinus nigra is what we're talking about here. That is, of the 3 ash, the least resistant. It seems that, you know, with green ash, like the lingering ash work is showing, you know, 1 to 3% survive. And then I showed some data with white ash that sometimes it's a pretty high percentage. With black ash, there really hasn't been much evidence of like lingering ash. You know, just it's a different lineage and its wounding response. It just does not. It's easily killed by emerald ash borer. It's the way it responds to the insect. And so I think 2 things can be learned. I know this sharing across like basket making communities. There's been discussion about how to stockpile and store, knowledge being passed along, you know, once ash is gone, like mature ash, you know, so experiences from tribes in Michigan and that region where you've lost basically almost all the mature black ash basket quality material, that does shift your strategies a bit towards more of the, you know, are we preserving splints and doing like large pounding events, sinking logs? How do we best store logs? How do you rehydrate splints that have been stored for many years and ultimately might be many decades? And so I think if I talk about like lessons learned from preservation, I will always go back to Les Benedict and Richard David, and we learned a lot. We've already learned a ton on how to preserve the seed, how to regenerate the species, and that I think is fundamental knowledge to how do we keep that as an option. But we're also learning a bit, you know, in terms of like once it's lost, how do we sustain those values? With the more like biocontrol and insecticide piece, I think in many cases that's still a work in progress. But I think the work that the Akwesasne Task Force is doing, that's kind of the next wave. How do we integrate silviculture with all these other techniques on the landscape? But yeah, I don't know in terms of Ontario or Nova Scotia or Quebec or other places where it's also operating. But I'd say that the greatest knowledge right now is coming from the tribal community that's really been thinking about this for a while.
Great. Well, it is 1 o'clock. So again, I apologize. We had a lot of really great questions. We'll do our best to look through them and share some resources. Those resources will probably be coming early next week. So be on the lookout for those. Yeah, I also wanted to obviously thank Tony and Paul for taking their time and sharing their expertise with us. And I also wanted to thank the Vermont Woodlands Association for co-presenting this today. And yeah, I really appreciate everybody taking the time.
Dan, can I say one last thing?
Please.
We need you. It's not over. Be creative. Creative partnerships, towns, land trusts, foresters, landowners, state, federal agencies. You know, each one of these partnerships is a little different. They've got different funding sources or different people leading it, or it's on obviously different land that's held in different ways. It just, it's not over. We need people sort of out there working on it. And it's not, I don't know as if the answer is going to come from some research paper. I think what we're seeing is the answer is going to come from all of you and in the lessons that you're learning and sharing among one another. So thank you for coming today, and please don't give up.
That's a great message to end with. So yeah, I think we'll end it there. And thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day.